All right, welcome back, everybody. It's a brand new episode of the KPS Stories podcast. This might be the scariest one yet. I'm your host, Steve.
And I'm your co-host, Kayla. You're not going to hear much from me today because my voice is not all here.
We have a special guest with us here today, Tim.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, Tim. So, we're here to talk about demons this evening, which is something I've kind of wanted to address for a while, but the flow of the series and the questions from the callers never really went in this direction. So, Tim, you said you know a little bit about demons.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a paranormal fanatic. I enjoy learning about some of the stuff. I know some demonology, but not anywhere where I call myself an expert at any possible way. But I know some basics. I know my Beelzebubs from my balls, and my I didn't realize how bad that sounded until now. So, 2 A's in that word.
Correct.
Yeah.
Every time I teach like the Old Testament in a religion class, it's like I tell them, you're all mature enough for me to say ball, but if you were kids, I would say Baal, because they can't handle that. It's funny, I guess, when you read the passage where the Israelites worship the balls and God is mad at them. So, I've been watching the old episodes of A Haunting on Discovery Plus these last couple days because I finally bit the bullet and bought the subscription service. And something that immediately stuck out to me was just how much the portrayal of demons and dark entities has changed in the past 15 years. Because in this show, the first season's from 2005, and it's like when they mention a demon, that's like the climactic, scary moment of the episode. It'll show like a badly animated shadow move across the screen, or maybe you'll hear a laugh, and that's it. But when I watch one of these shows today from the last year or two, the dude gets possessed within 5 minutes in every episode. And they have to keep getting more and more ridiculous, where stuff is flying and they're talking in different voices and all this kind of shit. And I just wonder, how far can we keep pushing this? How do we continue to make scary content still be scary in a new age?
Well, a lot of it's just due to people feeling like they need to keep amping up their media. And we live in a kind of very visual age of media. I don't think visual is the right word for that. What I'm trying to say is that our media is, especially in America, it's so it needs to be in your face and obvious, or they don't think people will understand it. So if you're just insinuating it's a demon and trying to talk about how scary demonic oppression is, they don't think you'll get it. So they have to jump to possession immediately, so someone starts spinning around, vomiting, and like eating their cat. So if they understand that you're dealing with like a horrible monster, but it's also like there's a whole lead up of like them taking you apart mentally, and that's also part of the horror of it, because the possession's only like when it gets bad enough, they jump in there and they try moving you towards the next goal, which is whatever said demon wants. Not gonna put any words in their mouths, and they know it gets views. People see the Exorcist, the parts where she's doing her telekinesis and spinning around and throwing up, and they're like, oh, we need that and everything, because we can't just have a normal ghost story anymore.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think very recently to an episode of Ghost Adventures I watched where not only was this person possessed, they also were killed by this demon, just like out in the street one day. And the eyewitness said that he saw this lady running down the street and this dark figure chasing her, and then she just died. Because like you said, a traditional haunting story where it's mostly psychological just isn't scary enough. It's not impactful. It doesn't hit hard enough. You have to keep getting more and more ridiculous. And I don't know. It just seems like we've gotten so far away from what the lore tells us and what the traditions tell us about the way that these hauntings proceed and what to expect and what not to expect. And it calls to mind a little Keystone story that I remember from a few years back, where somebody was on an investigation with me on campus, and when she got back to her room that night, she sends me a picture of these faint scratches, and she said something like she was attacked by this entity. Now, I don't know about that. I wouldn't jump to that conclusion immediately. It looked more just like scratches from literally anything else. And there are plenty of stories of people living on campus where they'll hear squirrels in their ducts, or they'll hear rats in their room in the middle of the night. And in a lot of ways, that's scarier than having a demonic force, because we can contain these rodents, but for whatever reason, they continue on unabated. So, Tim, tell us a little more about your interest in the paranormal.
I'm just very interested in what's beyond the experience that we're having now, and just kind of seeing and experiencing it, because it's hard to understand if it's actually there, but at the same time, I kind of feel like it wouldn't make sense if it wasn't. There's too many things about existence that are just too weird for me to say that there's not something more. But at the same time, I think humans are much scarier than demons, because at least demons are consistent.
That's a very interesting point, because they do tend to do the same thing over and over. There seems to be a pattern to them, whereas with people who are unstable, or even just regular people, you never quite know what's coming next. So that's something to definitely think about. Now, how much have you gotten into the lore here? Like, tell us what you know, I guess.
Well, I've listened to several of the stories from the Bible about King Solomon binding different demons for different reasons. Oh, he summoned Asmodeus, and I think we believe he summoned Asmodeus' son, and then another demon has to hold a pillar until the end of time, and of course, like, there's the Dante's Inferno stuff, which is not even canonical at all, but people think it is. But I think that's really funny, because a lot of it's just Dante talking about people he doesn't like being in hell, and yeah, so his fan fiction is just really popular in the modern world. So I know about some of that. I know some about demons from other cultures and just negative entities, and I'm very interested in the consistent themes that appear throughout different cultures referring to these entities and spirits, and how many different cultures do acknowledge that people being influenced or taken over by these things is an actual issue that they've gone through, and how they each devise different rituals, sometimes similar, sometimes not, to eliminate the influence of the entity and free the person.
Yeah, it's very interesting to watch how just spirit possession in general is viewed in different parts of the world. In certain parts of the world, and even in certain parts of America, having a spirit use you to speak is seen as a good thing. If you're familiar with Pentecostalism, for example, it's a Christian group that wants the Holy Spirit to speak through the person. And they'll be in their service, they'll be praying and stuff together when this person will start to speak in another language. And they see it as the gift of the Spirit. Because in the New Testament, it talks about the discernment of spirits, the gifts of tongues, the gifts of prophecy, these kinds of things. Now, as far as what you're saying about like Solomon and all that, one of the more famous collections of demon lore is the Lesser Key of Solomon.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, where it's basically, it gives you all the sigils and all the incantations to summon all these different entities and bind them or control them. And something I remember seeing, like, more than I should have as a kid, were some of these things like spray painted under bridges and things like that. And I didn't know what it was when I was little, you know?
Yeah.
It makes much more sense now. And even just like, there's one spot on campus where there's something written in the so-called Theban script, the witch's writing. And it's just random letters, but it looks very scary and very daunting. If you don't know what it is, it just kind of looks like squiggles. They kind of look like bat wings in general shapes. And the only purpose of it is to create fear in people that don't know what it says. Yeah. It seems pretty effective. So, how do you think we distinguish between someone that's afflicted by an evil entity versus someone with a mental illness, for example?
Well, I think the main way that this has to be done is if you put the person with a mental illness in a room alone, will things just randomly happen outside of that room, or will all the phenomena be stuck into that room? If it's, if nothing's happening in the room, the person's delusional, they're imagining it, they've convinced themselves, or some other deep psychological problem, or they're faking it, which is a different type of psychological problem, but yeah.
Yeah.
But if you put them in this room and then you're walking down the hallway and your vase flies at you at a mile per hour and smashes into your head, yeah, that's probably a demon.
Yeah, that's pretty concerning.
It's usually not a good thing.
And that's something that it often is scrutinized by medical professionals and the like, who will say that it is a purely psychological thing. There are phenomena that you can't explain in that way. So, as you mentioned, if somebody possesses some kind of superhuman ability, like if as we're sitting here, I just pick you up with one hand and throw you across the room, that's something that no amount of mental illness is going to give me the strength to do. Or one of the other marks of demonic influence is knowledge of the unknowable. And that's very different of something that you can't know versus something that you shouldn't know. So, like, you shouldn't know Latin.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you start speaking Latin at me, that's disturbing. But it's very possible you've studied it for years and I just didn't know that. So, okay, that's something you shouldn't know. But if you told me my grandmother's middle name right now, that's something you couldn't know. Unless I told you, which I didn't. So
Yeah.
Where did you get that? Who told you this? And there's other things like this. One of the others is the aversion to sacred objects. It's said that the possessed person won't enter a church, for example. Or if you splash them with holy water, they writhe and shit like that. And one of the simple tests that I learned years ago was if you just put tap water in a holy water container and splash it on a person, if they writhe in pain, then they're making it up. And I think that happens more often than not. Similarly, there's lots of stories of people using a communion wafer to do much the same thing. If you just take an unconsecrated one, the person shouldn't have a reaction to it. But if they do, they're just making stuff up. And I do think that many people have an aversion to sacred objects just in general. I don't know that that's the best indicator. There are plenty of people I know that have told me if I stepped into a church, I would light on fire or something like that. Maybe. So I guess I'll ask you the $1 million question. Do you think you've ever seen any demonic activity?
No.
All right. And that's a good answer, because I think lots of people would go on a lengthy story about something that didn't happen in response to that question. I think it's extremely rare, even in our current society, where it's more at the public consciousness than ever before. And I think that's probably why it mostly doesn't happen, because people are looking for it in places where it's not.
Do you think you've ever seen any demonic activity, Steve?
Absolutely.
Care to elaborate?
I don't.
Fair enough.
Because there's the other thing. I think there are certain things that when you see them, you don't want to talk about them or think about them ever again.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of that.
Something my dad told me one night when he was very, very drunk. We were talking about Vietnam, and it was the only time he ever talked to me about Vietnam. And all he said to me was, you go out and people tell all these stories of all this stuff they did, they're full of it. But it's the people that will not even mention they were there that saw stuff and went through it. And I think it kind of applies to this as well.
Understandable.
So there's plenty of stories of demonic lore at Keystone that you guys might have heard. The most famous one being Ward Hall, the third floor of Ward. And it was interesting last week when I was walking back to my car after we recorded the all-new episode available on YouTube, that I saw the light on in the room where the seance supposedly happened and all the other lights were off. And it was kind of like, okay, are you trying to tell me something? Like, are you trying to get me to talk about this on the next episode? I guess it worked. So, the lore goes that before Ward Hall was student central and a place of dread to all who go there, it was an all-girls dorm. And interestingly enough, my mother-in-law dormed there once upon a time in the early 90s, late 80s. And supposedly, one night, they decided they were going to do a seance in one of their rooms on the third floor. And according to the same story, they conjured something that is in there to this day. And, oh, I guess I'll tell that story. It's not that shocking. When I was in security, it was early on. I was only here for a couple weeks. I was new enough at the job that I was still afraid I'd get in trouble if I left a light on. I'll put it that way. So it was 11:35 on a hot summer night, like late August, September, something like that. And I saw that the light was on the second floor ward in that little reception area. So I went up there by myself to turn off the light. And as I was standing there, I could hear the heavy footsteps come across the top floor, coming from the direction of the supposed seance room in that top corner. And I had heard the legends. I didn't believe them. My default response is kind of to not believe the Keystone legends until I see them for myself. But that was very interesting, to say the least. And whether that was just a generic ghost or whether it was some kind of demonic activity, I don't know. But in general, I think you can tell when you're dealing with one of these beings just by the way it makes you feel. If you have a classic ghost, maybe it's curious, maybe it's kind of interesting. You want to know more. But with this kind of being, you just feel dread. You feel despair from it. And in all of my experiences, it was more of a feeling than anything else. More than stuff that I had seen, stuff that I had heard, anything. It was just a feeling of dread that becomes more and more consuming as time goes by. To the point that you don't want to sleep at night, you don't want to eat, you just kind of want it to stop, if you get my meaning. And that's the part that you're never going to see in a TV show. Because as Tim was saying, a visual medium can't capture any of that stuff. Maybe in dialogue, but a lot of it goes far beyond having words for things. So Tim, you have any other stories you want to share?
I do have some Keystone stories, but mine are really, in terms of paranormal things, are very anticlimactic.
We can have you back for another episode specifically for certain like dorm stories and such.
You don't want those. But I do have two paranormal ones. The one is the first one's really not much of anything, but it was interesting. So my friend, he broke his ankle and was no longer on campus for this period of time, and his room was a bit messy when he left, because he left very suddenly because we were on the basement floor of Freyer. He literally couldn't do anything. So he, his roommate left. I was outside with my three friends, and the door to our RA's room was open. Mark, he works here. And so we were sitting there, and we hear really light scratching from inside his room. And our first thought is it's a rat. So we get Mark and like, hey, open the door. We're hearing sounds. So we open the door. Literally nothing has changed on his side of the room since he left. I was in there right before he left, so I kind of have some idea. Everything's the same. We don't see anything scurry around. So we shut the door, and it immediately starts up again. So that's like my big ghost story, is the tiny door scratching.
I mean, that's something, man. I believe you.
And the thing with that, a lot of times these beings are trying to entice you. They want you to ask a question. They want you to give them entrance into your life. That's what that stuff is trying to accomplish. So if you think about a vampire, for example, it can't come in until you invite it. That's true of evil beings in the real world as well. They have the power that you give them. They have plenty of power, or appear to have plenty of power, but you have to buy in for them to really take it out. You think about temptation as well, it's the same thing. It comes back, it cycles. You can never really make it go away. And when you deal with an entity that's already dead, or an entity that was never alive, the best you could do is keep it away for a while, but it always comes back. And speaking of always comes back, we'll be here for a brand new episode next week. So make sure you join us and tell your friends, and that's it.
Thanks for being with us today, Tim.
You're welcome.
And we'll hopefully see you again in another episode, right?
More than likely.
All right.
Thanks, Tim. Have a good night.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night, guys. Join us next week.